Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you Ark's top 10 most underrated tames. In at number 10 is the Angler. Now this thing was released way back, and I do definitely fondly remember this thing from Squid's old Ark series, and his last episode on the Bongoman's Island map was taming the anglerfish, and still to this day this is actually a pretty useful creature for some certain specific Ark tasks, especially with their silica pearl gathering abilities, and that is pretty much all they have going for them. But silica pearls, if you didn't know already, are an extremely useful Ark resource, so that is why they are an extremely useful Ark creature which many people don't talk or even tame at all, and they just don't question it as a creature. They'll always go for something else. And yes, there are better sea creatures out there, but the Angler is great earlier on to mid-game stages in Ark, where you can't fully shell out for the most powerful ocean tames, but you still want to farm all of those silica pearls to get your fabrication up to the max. These creatures are really worth a tame at some point, as they aren't difficult at all, and they are extremely useful for gathering up all of those silica pearls. In at number 9 is the Chalicotherium. Now you may think this creature is just utterly useless, or you may think this creature is an absolutely insane tame and 100% worth it. And I'm kind of leaning more onto that side, as this creature does have a lot of abilities which many other creatures don't have. And also, the Chalicotherium has an absolutely insane knockback attack, and it is just a generally good creature for just dealing a lot of damage. It's a bit like a slightly worse Megatherium, which really does pack a punch, and it actually is a very decent travel mount as well. It has a very respectable speed stat, one of what you will not complain with at all, and it does have a wealth of other abilities as well, like it being able to throw literal rocks of, I think, even feces at the enemy player. But this ability will take some time to actually practice and get right, as it is a somewhat difficult ability to control, but when done right, it is a really fun, cool ability which does have many uses as well, as it essentially makes this thing a long-range fighting dinosaur, which many other Ark creatures simply do not have. The only one I can really think of off of hand is the Velonosaur's turret ability. In at number 8 is the Carbenemies. Now I know this will be a somewhat unpopular opinion among many of you, but in my opinion, my personal opinion, I really do enjoy the Carbenemies in the early stages of my Ark playing. In those early stages, it is extremely useful to get yourself a creature that can grind all of that oil and those silica pearls and all of those underwater resources. Yes, I will definitely agree this isn't the best creature out there to gather all of those berries and just harvest general things, as I'm pretty sure this thing can't even gather berries, but if it can, it is still an extremely slow Ark creature, which isn't great on land at all. But when it comes into the water, the Carbenemies does actually have some reasonable speed, and yes, just for reference, this B-roll does have some boosted speed on the Carbenemies, as I think it just looks really funny, and it definitely is really funny in my opinion. Comment down below if you think a really fast Carbenemies waggling its little legs really quickly is funny. You know, some people do, and I'm definitely one of those people. But yes, as you can see here in the B-roll, this is me going to gather some oil from the kind of depths of the ocean. Not obviously right to the bottom, as that wouldn't be great, as your player would simply run out of oxygen. As the time when you're getting the Carbenemies, you will not have the scuba tank. I'm pretty confident you won't. So yeah, you can always go into those lakes and lower lying rivers, and there you'll find some oil and definitely some silica pearls, and that is where I think the Carbenemies really shines the most. In at number 7 is the Beelzebufo. Now I know loads of people on my channel really do not feel as if the Beelzebufo is underrated, and they extremely love this creature, and they think it is one of the most popular Ark creatures. And among quite a lot of Ark players, the Beelzebufo is definitely very popular for its cementing paste gathering abilities. But the fact is, a lot of Ark players as well simply discount the Beelzebufo, and I was one of them before I tried it, as they will just simply say beaver dams are the most efficient way to gather cementing paste, and there isn't a point of spending all of that time to get yourself one of these absolutely amazing, charming Ark frogs, which now obviously I have turned my opinion over is simply not the case. In insect caves like the one on the island, the Beelzebufo really does shine, and you can gather thousands and thousands of cementing paste. And with Ark being a buggy game as well, sometimes beaver dams don't even spawn and can be an absolute nuisance to find. So knowing that you can literally just find some insects on a Beelzebufo to get that cementing paste is actually extremely useful as well, where you just can't find beaver dams and you just can't find that cementing paste. The Beelzebufo is definitely the best creature out there for reliable, quick cementing paste gathering. In at number 6 is the Casteroides. Now again, you may be kind of on the edge like the Beelzebufo with this creature, as you may either love it or hate it. These creatures do seem to be quite Marmite creatures, as you may just not see the use in taming a Casteroides. But before you have the chainsaw in Ark, the Casteroides is one of the best creatures for gathering wood. And you all know wood is a resource which you will need a lot of throughout the game. Right from the beginning all the way to the end stages of the Ark game, you will need all of that wood. The amount of wood that you will need in one Ark map playthrough is absolutely insane, and the beaver will really help you to actually get you there. And also the beaver is an extremely fast creature as well, and great in the water too, so it is a sort of upgrade to the carb enemies if you still can't get a creature that is underwater capable that actually spawns in the water, like the Megalodon or Ichthyosaurus or Plesiosaurus or Mosasaurus, which you may not have at the stage when you'll be taming these things. And also on top of that, they have an extra little special spicy ability as well, which makes them really nice to use. The fact is, their saddle is just a really nice portable smithy, extremely useful. In at number 5 is the Spinosaurus, and what a creature this is, and also in my opinion, what an underrated carnivore, as the Rex always seems to take the spotlight away from the Spinosaurus. And in my opinion, the Spinosaurus is pretty much what a Rex is, and in some cases it can be easier to tame, as it does spawn in less hostile environments, and it definitely has a lot of really great uses that the Rex simply can't partake in. Firstly, it has a really amazing turning circle, which the Rex simply can't compete with, as it can turn 360 on the spot, whereas the Rex's turning circle is absolutely atrocious, and in many situations it is so bad you can even get your Rex killed because it can't turn around and attack the creature that is attacking by its feet. Also, the Spinosaurus is great in the water too, and I'm pretty sure it does have an oxygen stat, even though it may not as well. I'm kind of a bit in between. It may have had one in the past and now it doesn't. Either way, its oxygen stat is really great, and it is a great underwater creature with creatures like the Baryonyx, the Mosasaurus, the Plesiosaurus, the Basilosaurus. The list literally goes on for underwater creatures, and unlike most underwater creatures, and pretty much every creature apart from this and the Shadowmane, it has the hydration buff, so it will do even more damage when in water, which is just simply great, as with any carnivore, you always like to have a buff. Sadly, it does not have the bleed ability, but still, that hydration buff is absolutely OP, and when it goes back onto its hind legs, this thing will do even more damage on top of that. It is definitely a great boss creature, and actually overall, I'm pretty sure it does more damage than the Rex, as it can attack faster, and I think its damage stat is higher. Its only real downside is its health is slightly worse than something like a Rex. In at number 4 is the Baryonyx. Now, this creature is definitely one of my favorites, and one creature that I will never forget in my Ark journey, and I'm surprised that so many other people don't talk about this to the extent that I do. And yes, it is not the most underrated creature out there, but I definitely think every single Ark player should have a Baryonyx in their roster of creatures, and they should know how to tame one effectively, efficiently, and know how to use one effectively as well. Yes, Shadowmanes are really great for caves now, but still the Baryonyx is my go-to 100%, as obviously its size means that this thing can fit into pretty much any cave. and compared to the Shadowmane, I'm just more used to using the Baryonyx, and yes, it may not be quite as versatile in terms of travel. In my opinion, this thing is still extremely useful and deserves a use, even though in some cases it is somewhat overtaken by the Shadowmane. Except the Shadowmane doesn't have the secret little ability that the Baryonyx has hidden up its sleeve. When it's in the water, it can literally stun creatures if you press C. And yes, the Shadowmane may have the hydration buff and things like that. The Shadowmane is a really great creature, don't get me wrong. It's just for things like caving and underwater exploration, I will always go Baryonyx before Shadowmane. And I would urge you to do that too. And also, they are a lot more accessible than the Shadowmane, as they do spawn on the island. Yes, I know the Shadowmane can be found on Fjorda, at least I'm pretty sure it can be found on Fjorda. So it is free to every Ark player out there, apart from Switch, I think doesn't have Fjorda yet, and obviously mobile doesn't. But on spawning on the island, it really does mean that this creature is the most accessible that it can be. Definitely worth the tame. In at number 3 is the Allosaurus. Yet again, another carnivore, which some people again may say they use all the time. But I really think the Allosaurus does not get the press that it really deserves, like the Spinosaurus and the Barry, as the Allo is by far one of the best boss creatures in Ark in general. And yes, the Rex may have more health, but the Allosaurus does an extremely immense amount of damage in packs, and it is just by far one of the most useful combat creatures in Ark. And with its pack buff, which obviously it will get from being in a pack, it can be buffed even more than a Rex can. And if you combine that with UT buffs on top of that, and the Daedon healing everything, you can have yourself a really great boss environment with Allos. And if you do breeding and mutations, you can have yourself an absolutely insane pack of Allos. And they don't tend to be as absolutely mind-bogglingly stupid as a Rex. These things will pretty much never get stuck on anything in the Ark terrain. And also, if you're doing the Overseer on the island, I would probably recommend bringing Allos, as getting through the tech cave with Rexes, just those Rexes, man, they will just get stuck in the lava and they will just die, and they'll just fall in the most stupid places, and it is really infuriating trying to retrieve them. So I will always use something like the Allo or the Spino if I'm feeling like it for the Overseer boss on the island. And I've only used Rexes once, and I completely regret it, as pretty much all of my army was killed in the tech cave, as all of the Rexes just decided, I don't want to live anymore, and I'm just going to jump straight into that lava. But obviously the Allo does not have any of those issues, and unlike the Rex, it has the all famous bleed ability. Definitely a carnivore to be proud and worth taming. In at number 2 is the Mantis. Now again, this is one of Ark's most accessible creatures, with this thing spawning on maps like Raasclark. And yes, albeit it may not have the easiest taming method out there, requiring you to passive feed it woolly rhino horns on Raasclark, or you can use Deathworm horns as well, and you will have to use Deathworm horns on the original map that it came on, which is Scorched Earth. And I get that many people do recognize the Mantis out there, but like the others, I really think everyone should have a Mantis in their roster, as some people may think it's just weak, useless, not worth it. Why even bother with all the prep and all of that just effort to get yourself some really good Mantises? And to that, I would say they are extremely great harvesters, and on a map like Raasclark, these are by far the go-to creature for gathering all of that mutton up. And they're definitely really fun harvesters to use as well. And pretty much any melee weapon that you can think of, apart from tech melee weapons, I'm pretty sure, these things will be able to wield and use to such a high level of ability. The only real downside to using a Mantis with your tools is the durability factor to it. But if you have Ascendant tools, then you will have a really great time, as those weapons are not going to break as often. The Mantis is definitely a tame every Ark player should have in their roster, and one every Ark player should tame, and in my opinion, it doesn't get the support that it actually really needs. And finally, in at number 1 is the Carnotaurus. Now, many people wouldn't have expected this thing to be in the number 1 slot, but in my opinion, the Carno is my favourite carnivore in Ark. Yes, I prefer it even above the Baryonyx. The amount of nostalgia I have with this creature and the amount of success I've had with this creature is absolutely insane. And when I did Genesis 1 for the first time, I beat the Master Controller, albeit on Gamma, with the Carnotauruses, and it went extremely well, and it was an extremely fun and useful boss fight for me to have. The Carnotauruses are actually a very viable boss creature, albeit they won't do what a Rex, a Spino, or an Allo can. They are still a really good middleman for doing those Gamma boss fights, and you can definitely push for Beta and Alpha depending on what the fight is, just maybe not with the Master Controller. And did you also know that Carnotaurus, translated from Latin into English, means meatball, which is why I always call my Carnotauruses meatball, partly because it sounds funny, but also it is just accurate to what Carnotaurus actually means. Also, since the Carnotaurus' release, this thing has been TLC'd, now having a second attack where it will headbutt the enemy creature and deal that all-famous bleed ability, which only one other creature on this list so far, being the Allosaurus, actually has. And again, this is something that something like the Spino or the Rex doesn't have, which is why it is extremely useful to have yourself a Carnotaurus, and as always, call this thing Carny Dave. In at number 10, we have the Chalicotherium, and in my opinion, this creature really does have to just make this list, because, like, when you look at it and its taming method, and kind of how useful this creature is, but also how much more useful this creature could be if it did get a TLC, it really makes me feel like this creature is in dire need of one. Maybe a slight change in the taming method would be sufficient. Maybe don't make it just a normal knockout tame, but maybe have some kind of different feeding material for a passive tame to make it more accessible to actually tame, because getting that beer is certainly something, but, you know, maybe that it gives the creature some sort of character to just its general identity, so maybe that wouldn't go ahead, and that's fine. But if it has just some general quality of life improvements, and actually for me it is mainly the taming method when coming back to it. If it had a more accessible taming method, if its rocks maybe did some more damage and were slightly more aimable, that's probably just my part, that could be useful. And maybe if it had some maybe like an extra special ability or something like that, it could really bring this creature together. And I'm actually keen to hear what you think your ideas should be for these creatures and what TLCs they should actually get. Next up, we have got the Basilisk, and I feel like this is such a cool creature when you think of it, but when you actually maybe use it in practice, it doesn't really hype up to everything. And partly I think it should have some better mobility overall, maybe some extra abilities on top of what it already has, maybe allow it to deal more damage. I think the tame method is fine, it makes sense. It's a little bit irritating, but considering what kind of creature this is, you would probably expect that. I'm fine with it. If they did want to change it in future with a TLC, that'd be fine, but that's not usually what TLCs are about. It would be adding some extra special abilities and like more maybe utilizing that underground ability even further, and maybe like an ability to send shockwaves and knock back creatures under the ground and like leap up under them and just demolish them. You could definitely use some really cool features with that as well, which aren't currently in the game. Now, next up, we've got the Giga, and I feel like it's a time at this point where this creature needs some sort of TLC, and maybe it's not in the most dire need, but I really feel like compared to the Crocodonsaurus and other creatures like that, it's very far behind in just what this creature is and what its abilities are like. And yeah, I know it's a lot easier to tame than a Crocodonsaurus in most cases. It's in some ways a lot more resource intensive because you need all of those trank arrows, but it's not as laborious of a method, and less things can kind of go wrong in the taming of this thing. But I still think it's quite dated in how it works as a creature compared to something like a Crocodonsaurus. I'm not saying like make it exactly like that creature, but maybe if it had the stats of like a wild Giga, maybe you'd still keep that rage buff if necessary. Otherwise, remove that, as you know it's quite a big hindrance, and the Crocodonsaurus doesn't have that, and I know I'm relating it a lot to that creature, but Ark is a different game now than what it was in 2016, so this creature, it has a lot of dated things about it, which is why I'm putting it on this list. I'm not saying like maybe it's in the most dire need of TLC, but I really do think Wildcard should give the Giga at some point a reconsider over, because it's such an influential Ark Tame, and I think it deserves something. In at number 7, we have got the Carb Enemies, and I put this thing here as I think it could be a really useful starter tame. It kind of already is, but it could be even better if it had just a little TLC, and maybe increase its movement a little bit, give it some special abilities, possibly some kind of spinning attack that could stun some enemies underwater, maybe give it some better gathering features, possibly something like that. You could even maybe give it the pack buff in a pack. I know it's not really the most useful thing. Again, very keen to hear your ideas on what TLCs you think these creatures should get, and what actually other creatures which I haven't put on this list, which you think you need TLC should actually have. Personally, for me, if it had some kind of special attack on top of it, its saddle is fine. Not like it, yeah, the cementing pace is a little bit of a hindrance. You could make that a little bit cheaper, but it kind of makes sense. It is a good underwater creature. I'd say maybe boost its speed a little bit, add maybe more of an essence of damage, maybe make these things better turret soakers. There are just so many good opportunities with this creature, which I think Wildcard kind of misses out on, and I feel like it could be a really high step of a level over where the Parasol was. And the Stego is such a different creature now to what it was before it had that TLC, and if the Carb Enemies could go under similar treatment, maybe if not as OP as the Stego, it could be a really useful thing for the Carb Enemies to have. And I personally think it's quite underrated and people don't give it enough credit, and if it had that TLC, then maybe it would bring this creature to some new heights. Next up, we've got the Angler, the king of harvesting any kind of silica pearls, but personally I think it can be used and remembered for a lot more than that. It can be just a really great, agile, maybe higher damage dealing creature with some other wealth of abilities, and maybe it could do something with obviously the main thing that defines an anglerfish, which is the light on the front of it, and it could possibly do something. But I'm not actually sure how much it illuminates, but if it would be kind of useful if you could really use it to illuminate your way in the night, that would be quite nice. If it had some kind of basic saddle and armor, that would boost it up another level, and some more special abilities, because all it can really do is attack and just gather some silica pearls. And I feel like you can be really inventive with this creature and its design. Although yes, maybe it's not the most dinosaur-like creature, I still think there's a lot that can be done to this creature to improve it in everything that it stands for, instead of just being a good silica pearl gatherer and just your generic basic ocean tame. At number 5, we got the Packy, and this creature really just has to be here for me on this list. And it's kind of sad looking at this because it's so useless, but with just a few simple changes it could be a much better creature. Firstly, if it could gather berries, that would put this thing at significantly better heights for general use. Also, I think the mobility of this creature is fine. Its special attack could be utilized in a better fashion if you had more mobility when it was actually charging, because it's not particularly OP. If it dealt a little bit more torpor, that could be nice. If its taming method wasn't so long and laborious, that would make this creature a more defined, useful one. And if it had some maybe special harvesting abilities, or some kind of buff it gave other creatures, or something small like that, like a buff and obviously the ability to gather berries and just a tame method that isn't as difficult, then it could really boost this creature in terms of its abilities and where it actually is in the game, because you can just get a Parasol and that creature is going to do so much more good. And it took absolutely ages to kill this raptor. Personally, I do think these things should deal a little bit more damage just to the general creatures, possibly because they are quite heavily armored creatures. It would make sense. Next up, we've got the Archaeopteryx, but I'm also going to put the Galley in a similar spot as well, as I think the Galley is just lacking in the health department and a bit of damage as well, although it doesn't really need that, and some weight definitely that could drastically improve that creature. And again, maybe a special ability of sorts, maybe like an extra dash. But talking about the Archaeopteryx, since the glide suit came out, and the cinema crops after that as well, this creature is pretty much just useless, and it's just an old version of those two things. If you could use this thing like a cinema crops though, and is sort of an alternative to that creature on other maps, as the cinema crops isn't on every map, then it could really boost this creature. It could just be a better use of a creature. You can still use it like a hang glider, but then you wouldn't have to carry it. It could just go on your back normally. And yeah, there's a few things that you can do with this creature which can turn it from something completely useless to something like the Cinema Crops. At number 3, we've got the Megalosaurus, and the female version, of course, not the male one. That's a good thatch gatherer. Personally, I think, yeah, maybe this is only really used for breeding just Megalosauruses, but you could at least do something with this creature. It can't even attack. It has no attack whatsoever. This is in dire need of some sort of TLC to actually be a useful creature. Apart from that one use, which isn't even really utilizing this creature, it's just essentially using it as a placeholder to make baby Megalosauruses, and then if you get female babies out of that, it's not good. You only want the male babies out of it to get good thatch gatherers and whatever you use general male Megalosauruses for. The female one, it's just, yeah, maybe it doesn't have all the horns and all of that, but I still think it should have some sort of edge, which would be like, why you tame this creature apart from just, oh, I want to breed some Megalosauruses, so I'm going to get both of these. And I know generally most Ark creatures don't have distinction between both genders of creatures, and considering this one does, I feel like Wildcard could do something with this creature to really highlight those differences, and you'd have different uses for both instead of this one just being like utterly useless and obsolete. Next up, we've got the Microraptor, and the reason why I'm putting it so high on the list isn't necessarily because I think it needs the most amount of TLC, but I think its ability is quite a cool and interesting one, and if utilized properly, it could really make this a good sidekick. Again, if you just have this just like maybe on your back or on your shoulder, I think you can actually put this thing on your shoulder, but if you have it on your back like a Cinema Crops or another creature, I'm just trying to think there, I think the Seeker, whatever it's called, has that same sort of ability. Actually don't, I think that's in a mod, but still, if it had that, and then you could just send it on riders and then it would come back onto you, so you could knock people off their riders and then it would come back to your back. That could just be a really cool, simple ability for this creature to have. And in at number 1 is the Aranio, and there are so many things that you can do cool with spiders, and I'm kind of going to put the Onyx here as well, although maybe if you turn the Onyx into something more like the Desmodus, but maybe a slightly dumbed down version that was easier to tame, that could be very useful because that creature is pretty much obsolete. With this creature though, the Aranio, if it had the ability to climb up walls, something simple like that, and it actually dealt some reasonable amount of damage and had some decent health and all things like that, then it wouldn't just be a sort of placeholder obsolete creature which you would only tame if you wanted to tame every creature on Ark, and it's actually just a generally huge pain to tame this creature, so I'd recommend a slight change in that taming method. And if you could do that and make this sort of like the Bloodstalker but have some distinction, it could be a really great creature. But anyway, that is the end of today's video, and I want to know from you, what creatures do you think need TLC, and what TLC ideas do you have for these creatures? As always, comment down below if you agree with this list. If not, put your 10 down in the comments below, and with that, I'll see you all later.